the situation then on the ground? Can we expect another approach?
We are at this moment looking at a very large emergency. It looks like we...
It's 10:24 in the morning. A Boeing 737 descends through the grey clouds above the flat polders north of Amsterdam. It's lining up for runway 18 right at Schiphol International. Everything is going as normal. It's a routine flight operated on this day by 3 experienced pilots. But, unbeknownst to the crew, a seemingly minor issue with one of their aircraft systems was beginning to align with the exact conditions needed to make it very dangerous. Moments later, the stick shaker activated, indicating an impending stall. The pilots, caught off guard by this, have mere seconds to react to save their aircraft from entering a full stall and falling from the sky. This is a story of how automation, working exactly as designed, can nevertheless put an aircraft in a dire situation when fed erroneous data. The systems incapable of questioning what they are doing. The pilots blissfully unaware and expecting their aircraft to do what it's supposed to until the situation goes out of control. It's also a story of how a known and recurring flaw, which was thought to be minor, wasn't appreciated in terms of how serious it could be, turning this normal flight into a critical situation in only a matter of seconds. Will the pilots be able to save their aircraft, or will they stall and crash into the fields below? This is the story of Turkish Airlines Flight 1951. It's the morning of February 25th, 2009, at Istanbul's Ataturk airport. A Turkish Airlines Boeing 737-800 sits at the gate, preparing for Flight 1951, a routine sector to Amsterdam. The passengers board as normal, and the cargo is loaded. The pilots run through the checklists and set the plane up for their departure towards Holland. On board, there are 135 people, of which there are 128 passengers and 7 crew, including 3 pilots and 4 cabin crew. The plane was 7 years old at the time, which is fairly new in terms of aircraft age. It was registered TCJGE. It was in good condition overall, with no major defects. However, there was one issue which occurred intermittently, where the left radio altimeter gave erroneous altitude reading. This fault wasn't seen at the time to be a big deal, and was thought to be acceptable for normal operations. But this issue, as we will soon discover, will play a large role in what is about to happen to this aircraft. In the left seat of this flight was 54-year-old instructor captain Hasan Tashin Arazan. He was a former Turkish Air Force fleet commander. Captain Arazan had been working for Turkish Airlines since 1996 and was one of the most experienced pilots at the airline. He had over 17,000 hours of total flight time. Over 10,000 of those were on the 737. Alongside him was 42-year-old training first officer Murat Sezer. He would be pilot flying today. He was also an experienced pilot, and like the captain, he was ex-Air Force. He had 4,000 hours of total flight time, but only 40 of these were on the 737. This was a line training flight for him. And for those who do not know, line training is the final stage of training a pilot goes through before they become fully qualified pilots on the type. They are given the opportunity to fly a real jet and gain practical experience on the job. This is formally known as line training under supervision. For safety reasons, a line training flight is required to have a third pilot. On this flight, this was First Officer Olga Ozgur. He was 28 years old and had 2,100 hours of total flight time, 700 of which were on the 737. He previously flew the MD-80 before getting type rated on the 737 in 2006. All in all, the crew were highly experienced, even though training first officer Sezer had low hours on the type. He was, like the rest of the crew, very experienced overall. It would seem that the passengers were in safe hands, but if you have watched any air crash investigation documentaries before, you quickly realise that experience alone does not guarantee safety. At 8:15 that morning, the plane pushed back and began to taxi to the runway. At 8:22, they lined up with their departure runway. At 8:23, Sezer pushed the throttle forward, causing the 2 CFM56 7B26 engines to roar to take up power. Shortly after, Sezer rotated and brought the plane into the Wednesday morning sky. The weather over Istanbul was clear and unremarkable. The flight continued as normal throughout their cruise at 36,000 feet. But as you will soon see, the issues which will unveil themselves at the worst possible moment on final approach were already starting to appear. Now, before we start looking at the approach into Amsterdam and the subsequent incident, there's a couple of technical things you should know. We'll start simply by looking at the levels of automation used in landing a 737, or basically any other commercial plane for that matter. There are two main levels of automation besides fully manual, which is quite self-explanatory. On a fully automated landing, the autopilot will fly the approach as it has been programmed in the FMC, while the auto throttle, which is the part of the automatics that controls the engine thrust, is tasked with, as you guess, controlling the plane's speed. On an auto throttle only landing, which is usually referred to as a manual landing anyway, the pilot flying will assume the role of controlling the plane's flight path, while the auto throttle serves the same role as before. This is by far the most common type of landing when it comes to the level of automation, because number one, pilots need to keep their manual flight skills sharp, and number two, it's far more fun to control the plane yourself than letting the autopilot do it. Now, this is important. When a plane is about to land, the pilot or autopilot executes a flare maneuver. A flare is when the nose of the aircraft is brought up slightly so that the plane will land on its main landing gear. On a 737, a flare typically involves a nose-up pitch increase of about 2 to 3 degrees above the approach attitude, leading to about a 5 degrees nose-up attitude on touchdown. Another important part of the flare, and this will be very important later, is retarding the thrust. This is done quite simply because having excess thrust will increase airspeed, which in turn increases lift, and with the higher angle of attack, will cause the aircraft to float, or even start climbing again. All in all, a flare ensures the plane will land smoothly. Next, we're going to look at the autopilot in more detail. This is necessary if you want to have the full picture of what's going on during the final approach. Firstly, there are two computers on the 737 which are the brains of the autopilot system. These are Flight Control Computer A on the captain's side, and B on the first officer's side. These computers take data such as speed, height, and angle of attack and use them to control the aircraft, following the pre-programmed route on the flight management computer. But for this story, those computers won't be relevant. The auto throttle will be the most important system, and it has its own computer. It takes its information from multiple sources, and crucially, it takes its radio altimeter readings from the left radio altimeter alone. Remember I mentioned earlier that this plane had experienced issues with its radio altimeters in the past. First of all, what is a radio altimeter? Well, it's simply a means of measuring a plane's height above the ground. It does this by sending radio waves downwards and measuring how long it takes them to come back. The length of time taken will determine their altitude. Below 2,500 feet, it is incredibly accurate, but they are not designed to work any higher than this. Because of this, for most of the flight, the pilots and autopilot will rely on the barometric altimeter. This measures height using the principle that pressure decreases the higher you go. The lower the pressure, the higher you are. But you may be wondering, why exactly does the auto throttle and radio altimeter matter so much for this story? Well, going back to the flare maneuver, the autopilot and auto throttle are capable of executing the flare themselves, with the autopilot carrying out the pitch increase and the latter bringing the engines into retard. As we discussed earlier, it's very common for the pilots to manually control the plane's flight path, with the auto throttle engaged. In this case, the pilots can manually flare while the auto throttle will bring the thrust to idle. Well, how does the autopilot and auto throttle know when to do this? Well, the automatics are very condition-based machines, meaning they need certain criteria to be met in order to carry out actions. For the autopilot to carry out the flare, the plane has to be tracking the localizer and the glide slope, which are the two radio signals that make up the ILS, which is basically a radio beam system that guides aircraft down to the runway. Furthermore, both autopilots, Command A and B, must be engaged. Also, the plane must be in approach mode. If these conditions are met, then the plane will arm flare mode. Once the plane passes through 50 feet, ensuring that flare mode is still engaged, the plane will automatically flare. But that won't matter too much for this video. What will matter is the conditions required for the auto throttle to complete its role in the flare. For the auto throttle to enter retard flare mode, obviously the auto throttle must be engaged. Also, the plane must have a radio altitude of 27 feet or less, with flaps greater than 12.5 degrees. Furthermore, the auto throttle must be in a speed mode, and the aircraft must not be maintaining a selected altitude, or trying to climb to a higher altitude. And lastly, the auto throttle must not be in a mode consistent with a takeoff or go around. I know this was a lot of information to throw at you all at once, but if you want to understand what's going to happen during the approach, you kind of have to know this stuff. Remember previously I remarked on the fact that this plane had experienced issues with its radio altimeters in the past, specifically the left one. The problem was that it had a history of providing erroneous altitude readings. It doesn't take a genius to see how this could have serious consequences, but exactly how those consequences would unfold is harder to see for you, and disturbingly, the pilots as well. Just after takeoff, at approximately 400 feet above the ground, the left radio altimeter failed. Throughout the flight, it would give erroneous readings, varying from impossibly high to impossibly low values. But as Flight 1951 began approaching Amsterdam, it settled at an altitude reading of -8 feet. Cruising at 36,000 feet at 9:53 Central European Time, the crew began to run through their approach briefing, and shortly after, they were cleared to initiate their descent. By 10:04, the plane is soaring high above Holland. The crew gets in contact with Amsterdam Area Control, which instructs them to turn left on heading 300 and gives them descent clearance to flight level 150.
Turkish 1951, good day, turn left heading 300, descend to flight level 150, runway 18 right.
At 10:05, they are instructed to fly direct to the RTIP fix. At 10:07, they receive further descent clearance to flight level 100.
Turkish 1951, descend to flight level 100 to be leveled by RTIP, maintain the speed.
Followed by more descent clearance at 10:09 when they are cleared to flight level 70.
Turkish 1951, descend to flight level 70 after RTIP to Sierra Papa Lima.
At 10:15, they are handed over to Schiphol approach.
Turkish 1951, your speed 250 knots and contact approach 19050, bye-bye.
Approach control gives them further descent clearance to flight level 40. Next, they are cleared to Spikebor after RTIP.
Turkish 1951, hello, proceed Sierra Papa Yankee, descend to 40, speed okay for ILS 18 right.
But, as the captain was talking to Schiphol approach, the first real sign of trouble appears. While Schiphol approach is transmitting, the landing gear warning horn sounds. This horn is designed to remind pilots that they have not lowered their landing gear. It will sound if they haven't done so by 800 feet, provided they have a thrust lever setting at or below 20 degrees. But they were currently at 8,400 feet, far too high to extend the landing gear, and far too high for this horn to sound at all. As you might have guessed, this system was taking its height data from the faulty radio altimeter, explaining why such a warning would occur at such an unlikely height. The captain comments, radio altimeter, and landing gear. We can gather from this that he realised the faulty radio altimeter was causing the horn to sound. This was the first time that the cockpit voice recorder, which only records the last 2 hours of the flight, picked up any mention of the altimeter. The warning blares out for over a minute, then stops, only to return again at various intervals throughout the flight. This warning could have been a sign for the crew to evaluate the fault they had with their radio altimeter. They should have considered what other systems were affected and the potential consequences of the erroneous data being fed to them. But they didn't do this. And, as we will soon see, this won't be the only warning sign the pilots will get and ignore. At 10:17, they get further descent clearance to 2,000 feet.
Turkish 1951, descend to 2,000, 1027.
2,000, 1027, 1951.
Shortly after, ATC instructs them to turn on heading 265 degrees. The aircraft is at this point being positioned for final approach. At 10:22, the aircraft reached 2,000 feet. The flaps were extended to 1 degree, and the speed was reduced to 195 knots. Not long after, Schiphol approach gave Flight 1951 its final heading of 210 degrees.
Turkish 1951, turn left heading 210, clear approach 18 right.
Left 210, clear 18 right, Turkish 1951.
They were now heading directly toward the localizer and were cleared for the ILS approach for runway 18 right. They were going to be doing a Cat 1 ILS approach. This requires them to see the runway at 200 feet. Out of the 3 categories of ILS approaches, a Cat 1 requires the most visibility compared to its counterparts. But visibility wouldn't affect this flight at all. The crew were going to allow the autopilot to follow the ILS, and then they would disengage and land the plane manually along with the autothrottle once they reached the decision height. I say autopilots because Turkish Airlines' standard procedures were to engage both Command B, which was already engaged, and Command A as well. This is not particularly common in terms of manual landings where the autopilot flies the initial approach. One autopilot is more than capable of following the ILS down to the decision height. Having both autopilots engaged is most often done when the pilots are planning to do an autoland, because this is a requirement for the 737 to land itself, but nevertheless it was still a standard procedure at the airline. I brought this up particularly because when First Officer Murat tried to engage Command A, it disengaged both autopilots. Now, the First Officer did make a mistake here. He should have engaged approach mode first if he wanted the two autopilots to engage simultaneously, but he did not do this. Even though this was the case, the 737's normal logic would not be to simply disengage both of them. It would have been to switch over to Command A. The fact that both autopilots disengaged indicates that something is very wrong with the left autopilot. The final report does not clearly tell us what the issue was here, but this was more than likely due to the faulty radio altimeter. Nevertheless, having both autopilots engaged was not required, even though it was standard procedure. So, Murat engaged a perfectly normal Command B. He did not make any further attempts to engage Command A as well. This is another warning sign the pilots ignored. At 10:23, the pilots continued configuring for landing. The speed was reduced from 195 knots to 170 knots. The flaps were extended first to 5 degrees and moments later to 15 degrees, followed by further speed change down to 160 knots, and after that the landing gear was also lowered. Amsterdam Schiphol is consistently ranked Europe's 4th busiest airports, and because of this, efficiency is required. It's very common for planes flying into Schiphol to be vectored to the ILS when they are quite high and quite close to the airport, sometimes leading to the planes intercepting the glide slope at less than 6 miles from the runway and from above. At less busy airports, it's the norm to intercept at 8 to 10 miles from the runway and usually from below. Due to this factor, planes have to descend rather quickly in order to intercept the glide slope. This is one of the final elements which is going to make this incident possible. Flight 1951 is currently on a heading of 210 degrees, which would lead to the plane intercepting the glide slope at 6.2 nautical miles from the runway. But strong winds have blown the plane 9 degrees off this heading. Now, on a heading of 201 degrees, the plane will intercept the glide slope not at 6.2 miles, but at 5.5 miles. There's nothing wrong with this, but it does increase the workload on the pilots and the speed that the plane has to descend at. At 10:24, the aircraft captures the localizer, but, of course, as I mentioned, they are very high. In order to intercept the glide slope, which is currently below them and moving further away, they need to descend rapidly. So, the pilots select the altitude to 1200 feet initially, and then to 700 feet. They engage vertical speed mode and set a descent rate of 1400 feet per minute. But the problem with this is that a descent rate like this would generate a lot of speed, so the auto throttle would have needed to bring the thrust back to idle, which it did. The pilots would have expected this auto throttle action, but looks can be deceiving. We'll get back to this point shortly. Just after the localizer intercept, Captain Hassan's roll bar, which is the flight director which represents the localizer, disappears. Both the roll bar and the pitch bar normally disappear just as the plane is about to flare. This is done because the pilots are not meant to be looking at the flight directors when they flare. This is obviously because the plane believes it is far lower than it is. The pilots do not mention this at all. They likely didn't notice this. This is yet another small issue which, if the pilots had seen, should have prompted some consideration, especially since it was on top of the broken altimeter, the landing gear warning horn, and the autopilot anomaly. Not too long after this, Flight 1951 intercepted the glide slope, and guess what happened to the captain's pitch bar? It disappeared, just like its horizontal counterpart. I mentioned a moment ago how the auto throttle had brought the thrust back to idle in order to maintain its speed. This would have seemed completely normal to the pilots, at least to the two more experienced crew members, Captain Hassan and safety pilot Olge. To them, it was just another fast descent at a busy airport, which needed idle power in order to not speed up too much and be unable to land. But, in a sick twist of fate, this normal, expected auto throttle action was not how it seemed. The auto throttle did not retard the thrust in order to keep the speed, but it did so because the engagement of vertical speed mode, along with the erroneous altitude readings, the flaps being greater than 12.5 degrees, the auto throttle being in a speed mode, and the fact that the aircraft wasn't trying to maintain an altitude or climb were all the conditions required for it to change from vertical speed mode to retard flare mode. The plane was less than 2,000 feet above the ground, and the auto throttle believed it was executing its role in the flare. It had the thrust back at idle, and it would stay there indefinitely until the pilots, who had no idea this was happening, manually brought the thrust levers forward. Even though the pilots had selected the speed to 160 knots, this didn't matter. The autothrottle wasn't in speed mode anymore. To further worsen the situation, once the glide slope was intercepted, the descent rate decreased, as vertical speed mode was no longer active. Instead, the autopilot was in the glide slope mode and was targeting the glide slope. The glide slope, having a much slower descent rate, meant less speed was being generated from the plane's downward momentum, meaning the engines would need to work harder in order to follow the glide slope. But the thrust levers were of course staying exactly where they were. As a result, the only option the autopilot had left if it wanted to follow the glide slope was to pitch up. But pitching up will only cause more drag, leading to faster speed decay and an even higher nose-up pitch in an eerily unsettling positive feedback loop. At 10:24, the crew got in contact with Schiphol Tower. Tower Control sends its last transmission to the flight, giving clearance for flight 1951 to land on runway 18 right.
Turkish Airlines 51, good morning. Runway 18 right, clear to land, wind 210 at 9.
Clear land, thank you, Rob, 951.
As the plane nears the runway, they pass through 1,000 feet. Importantly, this height was the landing gate for Turkish Airlines at the time. At this point, the plane should have been fully established, but it was not. They had planned a flaps 40 approach, but the flaps were only at 15 degrees. The speed was not at the correct approach speed of 144 knots, and the thrust was, as you know, at idle. On the contrary, at this point, it should have been at a normal approach setting of 55 degrees. At this point, the crew should have done a go-around, but they did not, and they continued their approach. They swiftly began configuring the plane for landing. The flaps were set to 40 degrees, and the speed was selected to 144 knots. But that was a futile action, since the autothrottle was not in speed mode anymore. It was still in retard flare mode. Next, they try and arm the speed brake. They get two lights, the speed brake armed light and the speed brake do not arm warning light. This is more than likely down to the radio altimeter fault. It's system logic that the speed brake cannot be armed when on the ground, and the -8 feet reading would definitely have caused this logic. As a matter of fact, this issue requires the pilots to complete a non-normal QRH procedure. However, this is not done. This is just another issue the pilots did not look into further. After this, the landing checklist is grabbed and ran through very quickly. At this point, the speed reached 144 knots, but of course, it began to decay further. At this point, the situation to us seems dire, but to the pilots, the same could not be said. To them, it was just an altimeter not doing its job and causing them some annoyances. But that all changed at 10:25 when they were 460 feet above the ground and travelling at an unbelievably low speed of 107 knots. At this point, the stick shaker activated, indicating an impending stall. This is one of the worst and most frightening warnings a Boeing pilot can hear, second to the ground proximity warning system alerts. Safety pilot Olga shouts desperately, pointing out the extremely low speed. First Officer Murat immediately initiates the stall recovery procedure, pushing the yoke forward to offload the wings and bringing the throttle forward. Captain Hazan then calls out that he has control, and he continues pushing forward. The crew have reacted to the stall very well so far. Their training is kicking in. At this point, it may have been possible to save the plane, but Captain Hazan looks at the speed, which isn't recovering. He then looks at the throttle and realises it's back at idle. The autothrottle is still engaged, and terrifyingly, it's still trying to bring the thrust to retard. The captain aggressively pushes the throttle forward again and disengages the autothrottle. He continues pushing forward on the yoke. Seconds later, the ground proximity warning system sounded, with a sink rate alert and a pull up alert. The speed finally began to build, but at this point it was far too late. And at 10:26 that morning, less than a mile from the runway, and travelling at just under 100 knots, the plane slammed into the ground.
Please go around, yeah, 262, go around.
Go around, yeah, 262.
1951, yeah, 262, do you see something on the ground which happened over there?
Negative, sir. We are in clouds. We are making this approach.
Fly 78 Alpha, go around, fly straight ahead.
Flyer 7 Alpha. What's the situation down on the ground? Can we expect another approach?
Fly 78 Alpha, well, we are at this moment looking at a very large emergency. It looks like we lost an aircraft, so continue on this heading, contact 1212.
First responders arrived on the scene in minutes. They were met with the sight of a plane broken in 3 pieces, debris scattered everywhere, and people walking and limping away with injuries ranging from minor to critical. In all, 9 people were killed, including the 3 pilots, 1 cabin crew member, and 5 passengers. 120 people were treated for injuries, 6 of whom were in critical condition. The main question on the minds of the Dutch Safety Board's investigators was, what happened and could it happen again? To investigators and to many watching from the outside, it looked eerily familiar to British Airways Flight 38, another Boeing which came down short of the runway, and another case where the thrust was not where it was supposed to be. But, unlike Flight 38, this plane's engines remained functional until the end. Eventually, the true cause was revealed, the -8 feet reading. The investigators concluded that when vertical speed mode was activated, the criteria had been met for the auto throttle to enter retard flare mode, and the radio altimeter reading was the primary culprit for its erroneous activation. Although technical failure was the main cause, the investigators found the crew's performance not to be up to standard. They had multiple chances to notice the situation was getting away from them. They never acted on any of the anomalies that showed up. Remarkably, this exact plane had experienced erroneous altitude readings on 148 occasions in the 10 months prior to this accident. Also, Boeing had received 12 reports of planes entering retard flare mode at inappropriate times due to the radio altimeter. Due to this, Rockwell Collins, the manufacturer of the 737's autopilot computers, updated the software. This update required a cross-check between the left and right radio altimeters before retard flare mode was initiated. But this plane was of course made before the update. However, before this crash, there were measures taken to ensure something like this wouldn't occur. The 737's dispatch deviation guide, which can be read pre-departure, stated that if the radio altimeter was known to be inoperative or faulty before departure, the pilots must not use it for an approach. But these were not meant to be read during the flight, so pilots had no way of gaining this information if it occurred during the flight. After the crash, Boeing added the radio altimeter to the minimum equipment list, stating that planes could not use it for the approach if it was faulty. The minimum equipment list has far more priority than the dispatch deviation guide, and it's an official legal book that airlines use to decide what equipment can be broken or non-functional under safe operations. Furthermore, after the flight, Boeing issued a bulletin telling pilots to monitor their FMA, which shows the pilots the modes that the autopilot is in. Lastly, Turkish Airlines added more training after the crash, including stall recovery training. In all, this crash was a mix of technical failure and pilot error, which resulted in the deaths of 9 people. It was a miracle that the crash happened where it did, and not in a more built up or unlevel area, which may have drastically increased the death toll.